So what I'd like to do today is to persuade you all that the biological games that are taking place in the Anthropocene are at least as interesting and at least as worthy of study as the biology and geography of loss. As biologists, as environmentalists, as conservationists, we're focused very much on the loss. But whenever the environment of the planet is perturbed, some things lose out, that's for sure, but other things are more successful. And we've been concentrating on those losses. And that's a sensible thing to do from many respects. But ultimately, someone called Darwin worked out that the future of life on Earth is actually in the hands of the winners, of the more successful species. And so we need to understand much more about the types of organisms and the types of environment where these biological successes are taking place if we're to gather a more balanced view of the world, that the way the world is changing. Are we living in a world where the biological planet is going to pot and it's forever doomed? Or are we just seeing a major transformation? Yes, but not necessarily one which is in all respects, or at least all respects from a human perspective, because we have none other, it's not necessarily always getting worse. So what I want to do is to contemplate a series of things. But I want to start with a little sort of personal story. This is my field. And I once, as a child, dreamt, like many other naive children, of digging a hole to Australia. That was not feasible, but it was much more feasible to dig a hole back to the Ice Age. And so that's exactly what I did. And what I've done here is to go back through the layers of soil in my field and consider those environments. And this is just the last 20,000 years. In the bottom of this little pit here, you can see the depth, it's not that deep. In the bottom here, we've got the clays of an Ice Age periglacial lake, full of things like Arctic char and cold climate diatoms and so on. Probably would have had polar bears hunting over it at some times of year. Then we got this sandy soil that is, in fact, when the lake drained, a lot of sand deposits were left. It generated sand dunes. My house is sat on an ancient sand dune. And this sort of steppe and dune-like vegetation that developed in the Vale of York was grazed by mammoths and woolly rhinoceros. Then the Holocene came, the warm climate of the last 10,000, 11,500 years, and a forest and marsh established, but then it primarily became forest, followed by agriculture, and then the horse pasture it is today. And as we go from the bottom here to here to here through time, and now with new species arriving in my garden, that I detect a new species at least every other year that is moving north with the climate warming, that again we're having a new biological transition taking place at the top of this, what in a geological perspective is an incredibly short period of time. So the complete biological community has turned over, it's turned over again, and then it's turned over again. So the idea that we have stable biological communities that exist in a particular place, and that's somehow eternally the correct composition of the biological community in a particular place. Once you start thinking about these timescales, is essentially a fiction. And not only is it a fiction, but we also know really quite robustly now that the faster the environment changes in the world, the faster these transitions take place. And there's one thing we're really confident about as environmentalists and biologists, is that the world's environment is changing very fast. So these transitions that are quite slow often in relation to our individual observations and lifetimes, but from a geological sense, the transformation is just incredibly fast. And so the idea that we can keep things as they are, and therefore change is necessarily worse, is not actually a feasible approach for us to take any longer. So when we start thinking about, so I said, from many places, most of the species that are there at the moment are eventually going to go, and they will be replaced by another set of species. And so the species being successful in new places is very much part of the story of life on Earth. If we cast our mind back billions of years rather than a few thousand, of course, we should remember that on average, the evolution and diversification of life, the rate of that has slightly exceeded the rate of loss. Most species that have ever existed, of course, are extinct. But the diversity of life we have today, microbial and macroscopic organisms like these, that is the tips of this branch, that the diversity we have is because on average things have diversified more than they have gone extinct. So life that we know now is the product of this diversification, if you like, of biological gains. During this period, of course, there have been setbacks. And we have, we have setbacks, we have these occasional big extinction events that somewhat arbitrarily, perhaps we have defined a big 5 extinction events in the last 500 million years. And the question then is, are we now entering a new major big extinction event? So this is just this came from the Washington Post, and so and they've written Age of Mammals here. Of course, there's more species of birds, so it's still the age of the dinosaurs. So the question is, and if anyone hasn't read Betsy Colbert's book, I strongly recommend it, The Sixth Extinction. So the idea is, are we now, as humans, generating a mass extinction number 6? Well, the rate at which we're doing so depends on what you assume about the future. If you assume at an accelerating rate of extinction, we could get there in maybe 1,000 years or so. If we consider a constant rate of extinction compared to what we've had in the past, then we're talking about 10,000 or so or more years before we would get to 3/4 of the species being exterminated. So that's very fast in geological time, so it is realistic to say that we could be entering a 6th mass extinction to rival the big 5, although it's sufficiently slow on a human timescale that we actually do have some capacity to do something about it. And for anything I say, I'm still strongly in favour of maintaining as many species on this planet as possible, not to keep the world as stable as possible, but because those species are the fuel, they are the building blocks of all of the new future biological communities that will come into existence. But even during this period of extinction, accelerated extinction, which is clearly happening, in some senses we're certainly in a mini-mass extinction, and we have, as scientists at least, we have the privilege of living through one of these and seeing what it looks like and asking, do the biological gains and the diversification associated with a major perturbation to the planet, do they also these perturbations start generating new diversity? In the previous mass extinctions were accompanied arguably by mass diversification events in their wake. But geologists tend to pick up diversification a very long time after it actually starts, because they tend to recognise things like new genera, and it takes millions and millions of years before something is so differentiated that you think it's a new genus. But living through such a mass extinction, we can start asking questions about the patterns of diversity gain. So first of all, I'm going to talk about ecological diversity gains. And I'm going to mention local diversity first of all, the regional diversity, so local diversity you can think about being generated by the births and deaths of individuals of each species, and then the arrival of new individuals of species that weren't there before, and then the departure or emigration of individuals. So these are sort of processes at a very local level, which might be a few square meters of ground if you were considering some plants, or could be a square kilometer or something. Then regional diversity, in which colonization and extinction are major processes, and then global diversity, in which the key processes are going to be speciation and extinction. And throughout this I'm going to talk about species as the entities. I apologise for that. That's mainly because we have most information on that, and I couldn't do a talk like this when we were talking about genetic diversity or some other levels of biodiversity. But that's what I'm going to talk about, species here. So if we consider local diversity in sort of spot samples, quadrats, the number of species per hectare, or up to a square kilometre, what do we get? Well, we find a whole mixture of results. Of course, we find places where a bit of tropical forest has been converted into a soy field, and the number of species per square metre of the soy field are there's far fewer species than there were. But we also have examples. This is from one of my students who's been a cricket international in his spare time for Mexico. He works at a Mexican school, and in 3 types of vegetation in Mexico, he's found that the modified vegetation, the black dots, have got larger numbers of bird species associated with them than the pristine environment. So local diversity can go up as a result of human perturbation. And in Britain, we are perhaps one of our most species-rich environments, calcareous grasslands, the chalk and limestone grasslands. You've got a few fragments in around the edges of Whiteland Wood, and that is a largely anthropogenic habitat. It wouldn't be there if it wasn't for humans having cleared the forest, grazing having then taken place, and large numbers of species immigrating and increasing that local diversity. If we look at British plants, you hear stories about how biological invasions are degrading biodiversity, and it's certainly true that there are lots of bird species, for example, on oceanic islands that have become extinct as a result of the arrival of rodents and other carnivorous mammals. But most non-native species assimilate into biological communities, particularly into human disturbed environments, and cause very little, if any, harm to the native biota. And in fact, in a study using the CEH Centre for Ecology and Hydrology countryside survey data, the number of non-native species, that's the change over time of this period, 1990 to 2007, the change in the number of native species in plots was positively correlated with changes in the number of native species. In other words, some places were getting better for plants and some places were getting worse. But the native species, it wasn't like there was a major so if invasive species or non-native species were driving all the natives out, we would expect a negative correlation. We see the opposite. So lots of species are arriving in different parts of the world, and they're adding to these local floras rather than detracting. 2 pieces of work in quite recently, one coordinated by Mark Velland and colleagues, and one by Maria Dornelis and many others. What they've done is to consider everything from, particularly Mark Velland has considered quadrat data for plants. Maria Dornelis has considered much more marine data, including sort of plankton trawls and so on. So these are local diversity where people have measured the diversity in a particular plot or on a particular transect, and then they've gone back at some time in the past. Some of these are continuous monitoring every year, some of them it was just monitored 1 year, and then maybe 20 years later someone went back and repeated it. So with these, the value here for 0 is no change in local diversity over time, and these monitored sites, the best collation of data from the world that we've got. And here is the 0 line on this graph. And you can see that the observations presented in slightly different ways, but the observations are more or less at the no change line, and in fact in both cases, although it's non-significant, there's a slight trend towards increase. So local diversity doesn't seem to be inexorably declining, although these major vegetation transformations can generate changes. So local diversity has stayed about the same, surprisingly. So what about regional diversity? Now, the people who are into ecosystem services, goods and services, who lots of ecosystem goods and services are delivered more or less by local diversity. And they're extremely angry about this result. But it is the result from monitored data. So it's not that ecosystem services haven't been degraded in any location, but if it's linked to diversity change, then actually we would expect those goods and services to be about the same. Regional diversity. So imagine the number of species in a big landscape that's 30 kilometres by 30 kilometres, or the number of species in Britain, or number of species on an oceanic island or in an archipelago. What's happening to those? Well, we know for plants the answer quite well, mainly from Dov Sachs's work. So on the left-hand graph, we've got the initial number of species, the estimated number of native species on a bunch of oceanic islands, mostly in the Pacific. This is a log scale here, and this is the current species richness. Because it's a log scale, most of these islands or island groups have today got more, about double the number of plant species growing on them than there were in the past. There are some endemic species that have died out, that is true, so that is a global loss. But if we're thinking just about the number of species per region, it's approximately doubled on these oceanic islands. The red circles here are states in the US, the black circles are regions of Europe. If they're, most of them are countries, but some of them are parts of countries. And now it's not on the logarithmic scale, this one. This is the number of initial species in each country and the current species richness. Actually, the initial species richness here is probably exaggerated because lots of the species that are considered native in European countries certainly owe their existence in those countries to early human activity. So it's somewhat dodgy to call it initial species richness. But for those, given the definitions that exist, that the average for regions within these continents is about 20% increase in the number of plant species per region. So in the case of the oceanic islands, nearly all of the additions have come since European sailors arrived. There are a few additions by the Pacific Islanders up to several thousand years ago. For the European ones, I think here they have included the archaeophytes, which are plants that have been introduced, are believed to have been introduced at any time. There are very few that are thought to have been introduced earlier than roughly Roman times. But of course a lot of land use had already changed before that. But again, the bulk of the introduced species here in both cases are within the last 300 to 400 years. So this is a sort of, for many of the species we don't have a very good idea of the exact arrival date. So here's Dan Simbaloff, who every so often, when I dare to write something in the literature, promptly writes a reply. A man I greatly admire, I should say. So here was him demonstrating how border controls could stop the import of species, and these triangles here are the number of species of mammal established in New Zealand over time. You can see starting here There were one or two before that, but mainly since 1800. And then here you've got the border controls stop, and one or two mammals have been eliminated since then. And here's the dash for Europe of non-native mammals establishing in Europe. So there's many more species of mammal in Europe now than there were a couple of centuries ago. If you add the mammals to the number of introduced bird species in New Zealand and consider the other vertebrate groups as well, there's also many more terrestrial vertebrate species in New Zealand than there used to be. But it's a very different biological world now, of course, because an oceanic biological community dominated by large birds in terms of the vertebrates has now turned into a biological community where the large vertebrates are mainly mammals. So we've got this, but if we just species counting, the number of species per region is going up. And I even took a trip, what a hardship, to the Atlantic forest of Brazil, because this is the classic of 93% forest loss, severe fragmentation of the remainder, the species, highest concentration more or less of one of the highest concentrations in the world of IUCN listed endangered species associated with habitat loss and transformation. And the interesting thing was that one species hasn't been seen for a while, another species is only surviving in captivity of the birds, but so yes, the real endangerment associated with forest loss, but things like the cattle tyrant that would have occurred previously in open habitats in South America and would have followed the megafauna around, the cattle tyrants of course are now associating with domestic livestock and have moved into this open grassy landscape. There's also burrowing owls, which have got long legs and they hunt in short vegetation and they don't hunt in the forest. And we've got cattle egrets that are colonists from Africa originally. So bizarrely, we've actually got more species in this region now associated with the habitat transformation because more species have arrived into the new human-derived environment than have been lost from the entire region as a result of the loss of forest and fragmentation for birds at least. We don't know for most taxonomic groups. So what we're seeing is that regional diversity seems to have increased pretty much everywhere for plants that there's any decent data. For vertebrates, most countries and islands for which there seems to be decent information, and for insects it's certainly true of the United Kingdom, but I don't think we necessarily have adequate data for any other country in the world. So when we think of a sort of region, it's fairly universal that the rate of arrival of new species in the Anthropocene, I'm being vague about the start date here, that in the human-dominated world, the rate of arrival of species has been higher than the rate of departure. So what about global diversity? Of course, this is in some senses the ultimate important thing. But it's quite difficult to know how important we should think the total number of species on the planet is because we don't even know what most of them are. In fact, once one starts thinking about microbial diversity, and if you're into this kind of thing, virus diversity, is we barely know to an order of magnitude what the diversity is on the planet. So whether losing individual species is such an enormous problem is something that can be debated. I do, as it personally happens, given my own cultural background, I do care rather a lot, but it certainly could be questioned. So what about extinction and speciation events? Obviously, speciation is normally a process that takes quite a long time, but we are seeing some species that, or you can debate whether they're full species yet, or simply very distinct entities that, if you like, are on their way to becoming species at some time in the future. One of the classic examples is the apple fly, these little flies that now lay their eggs on the developing fruit of the apple. The larvae are burrowing in and feeding on it, and then a native host, a Crataegus native North American hawthorn species, and these flies have now, they lay their eggs on the apples. They like the smell, they home in on the smell of the apples. In fact, they feed on it and they drop to the ground below the apples. They emerge in the spring at a time that coincides with when the developing apples are just the right time to lay their eggs, and they've shifted their life cycle so they are pretty much genetically distinct, or increasingly so, on the apple host. And this is an introduced plant in North America, so we know that this divergence has happened within a couple of centuries. And even neater is that these little parasitoids, these tiny little wasps that attack Ragalites species on native hosts, and the 3 separate species of these parasitic wasps that now seek out these flies, the larvae of these flies on the apples, and indeed they even are deterred, and that if you give them the smell of the native, what they do is when they're searching for a larva to attack, the first thing they do is to home in on the smell of the plant, because the plant's smellier than an individual larva, and so you can detect it from further away. So the first thing they do is to home in on the smell of the plant that the fly larvae are feeding on. And what these guys do is that some of them, this is one on snowberry, but some of these wasps now have become distinct, only attacking the apple one. So it seems like the story is that associated with one new plant in North America, something like 4 different insects are already on the route towards diverging and becoming separate species associated with this new plant. If you then consider the many, many thousands of plant species that have been distributed around the world, that this sort of process could be starting to happen everywhere. Another major consequence of the movement of species around the planet by us, partly by us as in introduced species, and partly because species like the house sparrow here on the top left-hand corner spread out of Central and Western Asia into agricultural land and urban and suburban areas. And in doing so, it met up with the Spanish sparrow. They got it together, and they're proud of their delightful offspring, the Italian sparrow, that has become pretty much genetically distinct. There is some hybridization still with house sparrow in the foothills of the Alps, but this is a genetically self-distinct and maintaining sparrow type, which is now regarded as a new hybrid species. So that's a case of one species spreading into human-modified environments and a previous geographic barrier being broken down. But of course there are many cases where we have moved species, and that has been what has transformed the world. So in Senecio, obviously we've got the delightful Oxford ragwort, which came from halfway up Mount Etna in a natural hybrid zone there between 2 species of European Senecio, and the famous story that it arrived in the Botanic Garden here, and then it found these sort of then once it got out of the Botanic Garden, its seeds blew out, and it found the walls and gravels of Oxford colleges much more volcanic-like environment than the soil of the garden, so they started to thrive. And you can see if you walk between here and the station, you can still find this plant growing out of cracks of walls and so on. And when it arrived at the railway station, it spread around the country, met up with other Senecios, hybridized with them, and generated some new species. So we also see it with Mimulus, with Spartina, the cordgrass here, and then Kew Gardens has got its own hybrid species, where 2 species of Primula from different parts of, one from North Africa probably, and one from southern Asia. They met together in a glass house in Kew Gardens. They generated a sterile hybrid, and then the hybrid had a doubling of its chromosomes or something like that, and then started to be a sexually reproducing species. It's entirely associated with humans. It's an obligate mutualist of humans, but if you look at your definition of a species, it is a species. It's just associated with us in just the same way that our body lice are associated with us. No more, no different. So what we've got is we've got about 7 new species of plant arising through hybridization in Britain in the last 300 years. And to generate this list, I've excluded a whole bunch of a rather sort of hopeful hybrids that are sort of distinct things, but probably not really clear species. So that's plus 7. If we look at the IUCN Red List, which is undoubtedly very far from complete, but then the number of new species that we know about is clearly very far from complete as well. If we look at the IUCN Red List, there's one species of viola that is listed as having become extinct as a whole species from the entirety of Europe in the same period. And this is just the number of new species in Britain. Now, I imagine that there are other distinct things that disappeared without us knowing, but presumably there was another mimulus found actually just a couple of years ago in Scotland. So it's not obvious in Europe that the rate of extinction of species of plant is higher than the rate of generation of new hybrid plant species. My personal belief is that the speciation rate is probably quite a lot higher, but we certainly don't have the evidence to be able to confirm that. So what I did is really sort of, it's back of envelope stuff, but Tree accepted it anyway. So, because I calculated the speciation rate of plants in Britain. Because up till this time, what had tended to happen was geneticists find a new species, and they're really interested in what the genetic mechanisms of chromosome change, genetic isolation from the parental plants has been. And so nobody had actually stepped back and say, well, yeah, these are some new species, so what's the speciation rate? Lots of people are out there calculating extinction rates at the moment. So that's what I tried to do, and I used the unit of new species per million species years, because that's the units that are often used to measure extinction rate. And so a value of 1 here would mean that if you had 1 million species and you followed them for a year, you would expect to get 1 new species as a result of it. If you had 1/10 of the number of species, then you'd get 1 new species in every 10 years, and so on. So this value of 1 is that. So 10 would be 10 per million species. And this is, if you work out the GB speciation rate since 1700, we're at about 10. Senecio, the fastest genus, we're getting on for 1,000. Based on phylogenies, and these are not completely comparable, we're looking at a historic rate on average of about 0.1, so maybe 1/10 or 100th of the current GB speciation rate. So this is historic speciation rate. And these lupinus in the lupins in the Andes, dianthus pinks in Eurasia, these are 2 genera of plants that have been studied especially because of their extraordinarily high speciation rate. I believe to be about the fastest speciating plants that we know about. And actually the average rate in Britain for the last 300 years has exceeded that. This is completely tentative, but it would be very nice for us. All I'm saying really is that the speciation rate does appear to have accelerated in the Anthropocene, because most of these are associated with species that have moved into new areas associated with us. And that it is at least as interesting to contemplate the generation of new diversity and new species as it is to document the rate of loss. And these rates are not so small that they can completely be ignored when you're comparing rates of extinction and speciation. of course, if you think of all of those animals and plants that have been transformed around the world, in the long run, unfortunately I'm not going to live a million years, or you're probably already saying thank goodness, but in the long run, we know if you look at species of oaks that originated somewhere, spread across Europe, Eastern Asia, North America, they evolved into multiple different species in different geographic regions associated with different habitats. So when you get a new type of thing evolving in one part of the world, then spreading out and colonizing the world, eventually it diverges into a whole bunch of different but related things in different regions. And we are doing that in a way that is completely unprecedented in the history of the planet. And this could arguably be the biggest spur to diversification and eventually the evolution of new species that quite possibly the planet has ever seen. Because we've got now thousands of species spread in many different regions of the world where they can start to diverge. And in fact, as a complete accident initially, Daniel Montesinos discovered that these star thistles growing in California had lost about half of their fertility with their closest relatives, with the same species, back in the Iberian Peninsula from where they came from, in, depending on the species, a century to a couple of centuries. So there is already some divergence starting to take place. And although, of course, you might say, well, species are being moved around all of the time, so won't this gene flow stop differentiation? But probably, I think the answer is not, because the rate at which new individuals so take the raccoon dogs in Europe, how many are there? I have no idea, but there's many, many thousands of them. How many new raccoon dogs are going to arrive and be released from Asia into Europe every year or every generation? It's a very, very small number. And so that any continuing gene flow is not going to be sufficient to stop raccoon dogs differentiating into somewhat different things at the two ends of the Asian continent. And so continuing gene flow, as long as species are adapting to the new environment, unless there's a very high rate of gene flow, it's unlikely to prevent differentiation. So I'm proposing that we may be on the verge, we may be experiencing, as a result of human perturbation, a sixth, if you like, mass origination, just as we may be generating potentially a sixth mass extinction. In fact, in my perturbed brain, I think that the sixth mass origination is more certain than the sixth mass extinction. But at some point, speciation is again going to exceed extinction. So there's a nice illustration that Veland et al. Have produced in an annual review in last year, in which they've gone for local diversity, regional diversity, and global diversity. And what you see here is associated with land use. Intense land use tends to decrease local diversity. Land use without conversion, major conversion, it's often increasing rather than decreasing. Habitat fragmentation, sometimes it increases the number of species in the landscape, sometimes it decreases it. Climate warming, and I have left out my climate change examples actually in interests of time, but climate change, on average, the climate is getting warmer, and on average precipitation is going up across the planet. We know that diversity tends to increase in warm and wet places on the planet and at warm and wet times in the planet. And so the overall expectation on average is somewhat higher local diversity as a result of climate change, even though large numbers of the species might be expected to be driven extinct. But most of those are localized montane species. And then nitrogen deposition, as far as we know, is on the whole decreasing local diversity. But in that long-term monitoring, local diversity is staying about the same. Regional diversity is usually higher than, though not absolutely everywhere, is usually higher because colonization exceeds regional extinction. And on the whole, we think certainly true for animals at this point, that the extinction rate is higher than the speciation rate, so global diversity is going up. So something of a matter of choice as to which you care about the most. So we have to get used to it that the Anthropocene is different. We're living in a world of change, and whether you might want the world to stay the way that it was, it isn't going to be. The human population is continuing to increase, our per capita consumption is continuing to go up, the environment is changing. And biological responses is very often it's the way that the natural biological system responds to and copes with perturbation rather than being some sign that the whole planet has suddenly gone wrong. So we can think of a regional community, which could be the region around Oxford. We've got introduced species, we've got species that are coming into human modified habitat, we've got species spreading in associated with climate change, and we might even, if we want to save some southern European species, we might even move a few species in deliberately as part of a conservation program. These are generating novel regional communities in which both evolution, ecological dynamics, evolution and co-evolution taking place. And then we've got species, some species are going to be driven out by some of the arrivals. Destruction of some of the previous habitats will remove some of the previous species, and there will be climate-related extinctions. But I've drawn these arrows bigger than these ones because the evidence to date is that the number of species per region is going up, not down. So we live in this perturbed planet, and if we're thinking about the future of the environment, people aren't going to go away, and I hope that everyone in this room would aspire to everyone in the world having enough to eat and be wealthy enough to have a good quality of life, which has major implications, of course, for global resource use. In this changed world, and world that inevitably is going to continue to change as the population goes up to 10 billion or whatever it reaches, and as I say, per capita consumption goes up, we can't treat nature as though it's an old master that we try to restore to what it was formerly. And the elderly lady was somebody who helped out in this particular religious establishment in Spain, I think it was, and thought that she would help, but unfortunately her artistic skills were not quite as good as the original artist. But I put it up to sort of remind us that, because with a painting, we imagine that the artist has generated and it's somehow in its prime, perfect, correct state. But all of the ecological processes we know about, all of the evolutionary processes which have given us the biological world that exists, they are all dynamic. And there was no point at which nature was perfect, was just so, and that we should then go away and say it should always be like this in the future. And it wasn't in some perfect state before the lot of us turned up and started making a mess of it. And species adapt to that environment. And now in many cases we're starting to see species that actually rely on the environment that has been changed. Those flies, those apple flies, rely on a human-associated environment. This race of checker spot, Taylor's checker spot, essentially the whole population is laying its eggs on, and its larvae are feeding on this plant, Plantago lanceolata, ribwort planted, a European weed that's growing in North America. It's changed its diet to feed on it, and if we were to remove that plant, then this butterfly would go extinct. But it's a native North American one. And interestingly, in one of the places, there's a woman's penitentiary where they're actually breeding these butterflies to release on sites where they've been planting out more plantains into the environment. So this is a transition. The longer these perturbations take place, the more the old species in the old places are now part of embedded in biological communities that include the native species, and just taking the new species out again isn't necessarily going to turn the situation back to what it used to be. So should we then think that these new species and new evolved types and then same species in new places, are they somehow bad? This is Spartina anglica, the most successful of the new hybrid species that came into existence in Britain when a North American Spartina met a British or European Spartina. They hybridized, they generated this plant, Spartina anglica, spread around the coast of Britain, and it's now spread to many other parts of the world. This is just a successful species, and hilariously, there's now a rail species, a very rare rail bird in part of the Californian coast that now requires introduced Spartina to breed successfully, and they're trying to work out whether what the best compromise is between maintaining the natural ecosystem and keeping the rail population going. So I would argue, if you're interested in have environmental concerns, think about what is an ultimate loss and fight that loss, but don't fight change, because change is often the response of the system, and often change in the long term over large spatial scales can sometimes be good rather than bad. So does the duration a species has been on the planet affect our opinion of how much we like that species? A new species somehow worse than old ones. This seems like a lot of people are effectively making the decision that they are, but there's nothing in the definition of a species which identifies the age of a species as being a key point. When our biological communities keep changing, should we be trying to keep them as well as they were, or should we be just letting it go? Or should we be saying, well, let's speed this up, because changing communities is how the communities actually will adjust most effectively. And when we start having endangered species, such as species that might be restricted, like say you've got a species of Narcissus, daffodil relative, that's endemic to one or two mountains in southern Spain, which some Narcissus are, and they're affected by climate change, which is warming, and in that region potentially drying as well. If such a species is endangered, should we say, well, why don't we get the National Trust to plant these Narcissus all over their countryside estates in Britain and naturalise them in Britain as at least as an insurance policy? So rather than, there's nothing special about any of the species we've got in Britain. Virtually all of them have arrived in the last 12,000 years, so why shouldn't we move more species in if those are species that would otherwise die out? So once we accept the dynamics of change, we have to start moulding our conservation approach, not to keep things in a particular state, but to direct them in ways that are most convenient to us. So I'll leave it there, as I say, with a shameless plug, and look forward to the discussion that now follows. Thank you.